Think of it this way. Politics can be a little like poker. You got to know when to hold him, know when to fold him. And this week, President Trump and Speaker Paul Ryan had to decide when to walk away. And on Friday, when to run. Does it make you want to break into song like it does me right now? Well, the president went all in on health care. He tried to bluff House Republicans with an ultimatum. Vote yes for this bill or be saddled with the shame of failing to repeal Obamacare. The president swore he was going to keep raising the stakes, insisting on a vote for his teetering health care bill. And minutes before the scheduled vote, the president folded his hand. So how does the president's health care bet look now? Let's talk it over with former professional poker champ Annie Duke, now a decision-making expert and author of How I Raised, Folded, Bluffed, Flirted, Cursed, and Won Millions. Annie, great to have you here with us.
Hi,
this should be an awesome discussion.
Hopefully.
I'd love to get your take. What was Trump's biggest strategic mistake?
Well, I think that there's a big difference between the kind of single party, two parties negotiating across the table from each other.
The two of
right,
us.
exactly. Where there's really kind of little to no cost to walking away from the deal, to this kind of situation where you're negotiating against somebody, I guess in this case sort of the Democrats, but in terms of your own coalition, it's really group decision making with lots of competing interests. I think that's really different than the kinds of negotiations he's done in the past, and I think he kind of ran headlong into that.
Trump in The Art of the Deal talked about one of the things that's important to know is when to walk away, to let the deal die, and in this case, he didn't walk away sooner, should he?
Well, I think that, it's that do this or else that can work very well in that negotiation across the table where you can sort of move things along very quickly. I think it was the speed with which it happened and then the stakes that he raised it to so quickly that was problematic. I think actually the big winners in this are probably going to be the Freedom Caucus.
Why?
Well, because the bill was crafted initially, I think, more to please the middle. And the Freedom Caucus didn't really care, right, if they obstructed it.
So they had a better strategy because they had less at risk?
I think that they had less at risk because they had always said that they wanted a full repeal from the beginning. And I think that they were always going to be the more difficult to negotiate with. So the problem is when you bluff like this, right? When you deliver this ultimatum, if someone calls your bluff, they generally end up having the power. So I think this is going to create a problem for the administration going forward and trying to negotiate, for example, tax reform. Because the Freedom Caucus has shown very clearly that they're willing to call the bluff, that they're not going to vote just because Republicans want this. And I think that's going to give them a lot of power going forward. It might have actually been better, I think, to start off with a bill that was pleasing to the Freedom Caucus, get them to have buy-in, and then go to the Tuesday group and kind of try to move the bill over there, because I think that they're in general wanting to be more cooperative with the Republican Party.
So it might have been more easy for the president to kind of switch his approach in terms of who he was trying to bring into the fold. Instead, he targeted the Freedom Caucus. Now, you described Trump and his negotiating style like this before the inauguration. You wrote, Trump-style aggression frequently succeeds. Players use that strategy of amped-up aggression, always betting, always raising, moving all their chips in no-limit games. So his aggressive style obviously didn't work here. Is it because this is politics and not business?
Well, I think that it can work in politics when you actually have the power to have someone not be able to do this kind of calling against you. So when he was putting his cabinet picks forward, for example, it was very difficult for anybody to stop him because the Democrats don't have the ability to do that. They don't have the majority.
Right.
In this particular case, though, with this kind of hot button issue, again, it was this group decision making where you had lots of competing interests with his own party. And so the aggressive stance, you can only take the aggressive stance if you're pretty high likelihood not to actually get called. And in terms of the cabinet picks, he wasn't very high likelihood to get called. In terms of this, I think that he was. And I think that's the problem. So it's understanding when is it okay to make those really big, high stakes kind of ultimatums. And generally it's when it's okay if you fail at it. Or if there's just very low probability that you're going to fail. You can think about before the election some of his aggression. I think he felt like he didn't have a lot to lose because the polls were against him. So again, if it doesn't work out, there isn't a particularly big consequence.
Kind of that whole idea of where can you go but up in some
exactly.
cases.
In that particular case, it was where can you go but up. With his cabinet choices, it was there's not a lot of opposition, so it was incredibly high probability to succeed. And you can always sort of put another cabinet pick behind it, so it's not so big a deal if like a Pudzer
In the case, in terms of if you were to advise him moving forward, he's talked about doing tax reform next. I mean, he hasn't had a lot of wins so far in his presidency, so he doesn't have a lot of political capital at his expense. Does he? How would you advise him moving forward with tax reform?
So I think that there are two choices that he can take. One is go to the Freedom Caucus first and then move center from there, because you want to go to the people who are going to be more obstructionist to begin with, and then allow the compromise to happen from there, and that gets the Freedom Caucus to have buy-in to the tax reform.
And you don't think he should go out, reach out to Democrats instead?
That's the second choice. So I said there were two things that he could do, right? So the first would be to take the tactic of going to the Freedom Caucus. The second is to say, well, I've lost the Freedom Caucus, so I'm just going to discount those votes from my vote total. How do I get that many Democrats to now come on board? And that's the other tactic he could take, to take a more middle of the road approach. The concern that I would have there is, what does that do with the more vocal part of his base? So I think he's in a tough spot now, having failed at this, because I think that he doesn't have as much capital. I think the Freedom Caucus has a lot more power going forward. I think it's going to create a lot of problems for him.
Did he oversell himself as a negotiator?
Well, so I think it's really interesting, because we're seeing this so publicly play out, which is actually kind of exciting for someone who's what I do in terms of analyzing it. I think that I don't know if he oversold himself as a negotiator in terms of the kinds of negotiations that he did before. But those kinds of negotiations are very different than this kind of group decision making, which is a whole different type of negotiation, and the skills don't necessarily transfer. And I think that on the public stage, we just saw that maybe the skills don't transfer so well, and he's got some sort of learning on the job to do.
All right. Thank you so much, Annie Duke. We really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
Offering your advice and expertise when it comes to deal making.